Tonight on Bridge City News, in an effort to keep drivers and passengers safe from COVID-19, the City of Lethbridge is changing the way it delivers transit. In a precautionary move, students at the University of Lethbridge were asked to vacate residences today and tomorrow. And Ottawa announced that it is spending more than $190 million to develop and produce vaccines to combat the novel coronavirus.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Robbins.
Thanks so much for joining us. The City of Lethbridge provided another update today to the COVID-19 situation in our city and outlined ways in which they're trying to keep us safe. Calgary has recently implemented a fine for gatherings of over 50 people. We asked city officials if they would consider putting similar plans in motion for the future.
We haven't got to that point yet. We're considering all options. We certainly will rely on the advice of our Director of Emergency Management Services and those from Alberta Health Services as well. So we want people to voluntarily follow that advice right now. There shouldn't be gatherings of more than 50 people. And we're actually discouraging gatherings of even just a few people. It should just be you and your family. If you're out in the community, in the park or something like that, please don't interact with others in any numbers whatsoever.
We are also committed to ensure all residents have access to utilities at this time. We will not be disconnecting any utility customers due to overdue accounts.
The City of Lethbridge also announced today that it is changing the way transit is being offered to prevent contact between drivers and riders. Anyone who needs to use transit is now being asked to load at the back of the bus, and riders will not be required to pay a fare. Anyone with special mobility or accessibility needs will be allowed to access the bus from the front entrance in order to use the ramp. The city also said today that they are continuing to clean buses daily, wiping down all touched surfaces, and continuing with regular disinfectant fogging treatments. Local philanthropist Cor Van Ray has donated $100,000 to the Lethbridge Interfaith Food Bank. Although he's in self-isolation himself, the local farmer expressed that he could not sit around and listen with so many people in need. The organization's executive director, Daniel McIntyre, shared exactly where the money will be going.
So this money is going to go directly to food, and our ability to partner with other agencies to get that emergency food assistance out to community members who are having a difficult time putting enough food on the table right now. Fortunately for us, this is a very sizable donation that should last us a bit of time. You know what, we haven't seen the mad rush as of yet. Right now we are seeing more challenges in getting food out to families who are not able to make it down physically to the food bank. So we've been partnering with some other agencies, the Lethbridge Food Bank, My City Care, Salvation Army, several groups, to be able to arrange to be able to make sure that those people who are in self-isolation are still able to get the supplies that they need.
Cor Van Ray has previously given millions of dollars to the university, college, Hospital Foundation, YMCA, and many other local projects. The province of Ontario will be providing $200 million in relief funding to food banks, shelters, and other emergency services in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Ontario reported its largest 24-hour jump in infections so far, with 78 new cases. There have been more than 500 cases in the province, including 6 deaths. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says Canada is spending $192 million on developing and producing vaccines for the novel coronavirus. He also announced that Parliament will reconvene tomorrow to pass legislation to do even more to combat COVID-19.
After conversations with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I can now confirm that the House of Commons will be recalled on Tuesday at noon so we can pass emergency legislation that will put our plan into motion. I recognize that millions of Canadians are practicing social distancing, are choosing to stay home, are looking for ways to keep 2 meters apart from each other, and taking this very seriously. That's great because this is a situation in which individual Canadians behaving responsibly will help themselves, help their neighbors, and mostly protect our healthcare workers. This is something we need to do together. We are, of course, continuing to work very closely with all provinces, with different orders of government, to make sure that people are understanding what they need to do and doing it. We will continue to look at possible next steps that may become necessary, but for now we are telling people, stay home. engage in social distancing, protect yourselves, protect our system, and let's get through this strongly as a country.
Trudeau also said Ottawa is working with Canadian Airlines to bring home more Canadians from abroad, with Air Canada, WestJet, and Air Transat all arranging flights around the globe. The 444 Canadians who've been stuck in Morocco arrived in Montreal over the weekend. Foreign Affairs Minister Francois-Philippe Champagne tweeted that the government also secured authorizations to operate 3 flights from Peru later this week. Ottawa's launched TV ads showing our country's Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Theresa Tam, giving direct warnings about safe and unsafe behavior during the COVID-19 pandemic.
COVID-19 is a serious public health threat. All Canadians must act now to reduce the spread. Avoid crowded places and practice social distancing. Avoid non-essential travel and stay home as much as possible. Self-isolate if you may have been exposed to COVID-19. Stay connected with neighbors, friends, and family. When you take care of yourself, you take care of others.
A message from the Government of Canada.
The province of Alberta is changing who it will test for the novel coronavirus. Travelers who return to our province after March 12th and have mild symptoms will no longer be tested for COVID-19, but instead are being told to self-isolate. Albertans who have already been told by HealthLink that they'll be tested will still receive the tests. Testing will now be prioritized for those showing symptoms who are hospitalized with respiratory illness and residents of continuing care facility. The AHS also says anyone with symptoms who does not fit the priority categories should stay home and self-isolate for a minimum of 10 days from the start of their symptoms or until symptoms resolve.
I will say, though, we simply do not have the capacity to test every Albertan with a cough. I do not anticipate that will change. And so you don't need a lab test to do the right thing. If you're sick, you need to stay home. And again, we will be working to expand our surveillance program, but people should not rely on a test result to take the appropriate actions of limiting spread of virus to others.
As of earlier this afternoon, there were 7 confirmed cases of the virus in the South Zone, including 4 here in Lethbridge. The province is providing more options for virtual patient care. New temporary physician billing codes are being added to the schedule of medical benefits so that physicians can bill for virtual care. Through these new health service codes, physicians will be paid the same rate as if medical services were being provided face-to-face. This is similar to billing codes already established in other provinces, such as BC and Ontario. As of today, the province opened up licensed childcare centres for up to 30 people, including staff. Children's Services is working with childcare providers to open up 15,000 childcare spaces, including here in Lethbridge.
Common sense would indicate that if we've closed the centre down, there's a whole bunch of, work that would need to go to restaff up again, along with determining what licensing registration would be, what's the funding model, who's paying, all those kind of things probably need to be ironed out. That's probably why we haven't heard from the government in depth yet on the program. We did hear that something might be coming down the pipe, but at this point we don't have enough information to make any real commitment as to what it looks like. But there's definitely a lot of steps involved in reopening a center that you've closed, in terms of getting staff back, determining who's available, because a lot of those families with our staff have kids too, so, how's their childcare situation going to be handled? All those kind of things need to be taken into account.
It was moving day for many students who are living in residence at the University of Lethbridge. The COVID-19 pandemic is forcing the U of L to shut down all of its residence buildings.
So what we're doing is we have asked all of our students who are able to be somewhere else, we're requiring them to move out of residences such that we can redistribute those that are remaining in residence, those who are international students, those who do not have safe alternative housing options, within our spaces that allow us to more effectively social distance. So practice the physical distancing, as I'm sure you can imagine. Residence spaces are, by their very nature, difficult spaces in which to practice effective social distancing. And so this is going to allow us to use those spaces, our townhouses, our places where we can position students who must remain on campus or need to remain on campus in spaces where they don't have to share washrooms, where they don't have to share kitchen facilities.
Students living in the Siksika and Sutina townhomes in Residence Village were asked to vacate by 4 o'clock today. Students living in University Hall, Kainai House, Pekani House, and Mount Blackistone House will be required to leave by 4 o'clock tomorrow. The university says students who have no place to move to will not be forced out and, quote, "We will make accommodations for the effect this has on coursework and exams." The university will also refund rent on a prorated basis for the remainder of the academic year. The Holy Spirit Catholic Division in Lethbridge has a warning about false advertising that was posted about the school and its closure.
We knew from the get-go that this was a scam, simply because we have been in close communication with Department of Education and Alberta Health Services on a regular basis, daily, in some cases more than once a day. So we knew that the information that was there was not accurate at all. And in times like this, it's certainly very trying, and we try to make sure that we convey the correct information from reliable sources.
Online classes started for all Holy Spirit High School students today, and all other grades will start on March 25th. Police in Lethbridge have charged a 28-year-old woman in connection with a robbery on Sunday. Police say a masked female entered Friday's liquor store on 13th Street North around 8:15 p.m. She took many bottles of booze, then as she attempted to leave the store, was confronted by a female clerk. The perpetrator punched the clerk and fled on foot. Thanks to the help of the K-9 unit, the woman was arrested a short time later. Mary Ann Smith of Lethbridge is charged with robbery, disguised with intent, and breach of a release order. She was scheduled to appear in court on June 25th. Lethbridge police have charged a 25-year-old man in connection with a stolen vehicle which struck a building. Last Friday, police responded to a report that a Ford Explorer was stolen from a home on 40th Avenue South. Police discovered the vehicle at the Dairy Queen drive-thru along 12th Avenue South. When they tried to pin the vehicle, the driver attempted to flee, collided with one of the police vehicles, and had subsequently smashed into the side of the Motel 6. Damage to the building and vehicle is estimated between $75,000 and $100,000. Anthony Douglas Johnson of Lethbridge and 26-year-old Brandon Chase Healy of Standoff face a wide range of charges. Lethbridge police are advising the public of scams surrounding COVID-19 and what you can really do to protect yourself.
Like anything, fraudsters have capitalized on the COVID-19 global pandemic. And regular, everyday people are being targeted. And they're mostly being targeted through phishing, whether that's texting or emailing. And it's a combination of things such as spreading false information and also requesting money or donations for nonprofit organizations to help support the fight against COVID-19. What we're asking the public is simply access information from trusted sources. So anything to do with the COVID-19 global pandemic, we must obtain information solely from the City of Lethbridge, the Province of Alberta, or the Government of Canada. No other source, I would consider that to be accurate. One other exception would be news media.
We are being advised that the LPS will never demand cash payments by wire transfer, gift cards, or any other means, that residents should never give out personal or financial information to unsolicited callers. Lethbridge police have charged a 19-year-old in connection with a series of break-and-enters in the downtown core. Police responded to reports of B&Es at the HSBC Bank on 4th Avenue South, the Melcor Centre, Hay Clinic, and Park Place Mall. 19-year-old Haley Ann Trenery of Lethbridge is charged with 3 counts of break-and-enter, committing mischief, and attempted shop-breaking. Trenery will appear in court on June 10th. The Canadian Olympic and Paralympic committees are refusing to send our athletes to the 2020 Tokyo Olympics unless they are postponed for 1 year. The Games are set to begin in July. In a release, Canadian Olympic officials said the coronavirus threat and risks make for an unsafe environment for athletes, their families, and the broader Canadian community. Australia is also calling for its athletes to prepare for 2021 instead. Russia is condemning what it says are attempts to pressure the International Olympic Committee into making rash decisions. A cruise ship that cut short its trip because of the coronavirus and mechanical problems docked yesterday in Honolulu's harbor. The Norwegian Jewel has around 2,000 passengers on board. The ship has problems with its propulsion, which will be repaired at the harbor. Now, according to the Highway Department of Transportation, the repairs to the ship must be made without passengers on board. A plan is being developed with Norwegian Cruise Line that will keep passengers isolated to avoid any potential strain on Hawaii's resources. U.S. President Donald Trump said the United States is currently working with more than 140 countries to fight the coronavirus and that it is willing to help Iran and North Korea.
If they need help, we'll give them help. There's nobody has what we have, especially with the new tests that are coming out. North Korea, Iran, by the way, and others. We are open for helping other countries. And there's a very serious time, and North Korea is going through something. Iran is going through something very, very strong. Iran is really going through a very difficult period with respect to this, as you know. So I've put it's really a glad hand, it's all it is, to North Korea, to Iran, and to many other countries. And we're working with, as the doctor can say, we're working with many countries with respect to the problems that they have. Again, it's over 140 countries right now.
Many who are shut in right now because of the coronavirus are finding it extremely difficult. Many, including our seniors. Now, there's a catering company in the United States that relies on volunteers to ensure that vulnerable Holocaust survivors have access to food while isolated in their homes.
This is our time. This is going to go down in history. And you're going to think back, what did I do to make a difference? How did I make other people's lives easier and better?
I'm not coming too close, Hannah.
I spoke to a different lady, a different Holocaust survivor, and she told me she literally feels like she's back in the ghetto. She's stuck. She has a fear. She doesn't have a fear of Hitler now. She has a fear of the coronavirus.
To me, my grandmothers are the most empowered women I know, both survivors of Auschwitz. So for me, my first reaction was, what are we doing for the elderly? Like, what are we doing for the survivors? They're so important to not only to me, but to the whole community and really to the whole world.
You food from that hut? Yeah. I'm going to leave it on the doorknob because I don't want to come upstairs.
Of course, we all listen to the news and we hear what's going on, that elderly should not be out in the street and running around. But we made sure that these people got food regardless.
Helping seniors, that's what it's truly all about. Lots of clouds and mild today, but flurries are on the way tomorrow and Wednesday. A full look at the weather picture is coming up. We had clouds mixed with sun today, but not too cool. Tonight, more clouds are rolling in with a chance of flurries developing in a low near -5. Tomorrow, more light snow developing with a high near +1. Wednesday, expect more flurries with the mercury dropping to -1. A high-pressure system returns on Thursday, bringing lots of sunshine and a high near 6. Friday, sunny again with a high near 8 degrees. A nice weekend is shaping up. Just a few clouds and 12 for Saturday, mainly cloudy, and 13 degrees expected on Sunday. Looking at the almanac, the average high for this time of year 7 degrees and an average low of -5. The highest temperature in the state was recorded in 1939 at 22 degrees, and the record low -25 in 1965. Sunrise was at 7:27, sunset at 7:49. Let's have a look at how tomorrow's looking across our beautiful country now. Victoria should receive showers and a high of 10. Expect light rain and 11 for Vancouver. A good chance of flurries and -3 for Calgary. Snow and -3 degrees as well for Edmonton. A chance of flurries and +2 for Regina. -3 and flurries for Saskatoon. Expect rain and 4 degrees in Winnipeg tomorrow. Overcast and 7 for Toronto. Showers and 7 as well for Ottawa. A mixture of sun and cloud and 5 degrees for Montreal. In Atlantic Canada, expect rain mixed with snow and a high of 4 degrees for both Fredericton, New Brunswick and Halifax, Nova Scotia. Periods of snow and +1 for Charlottetown, PEI. And in St. John's, Newfoundland, a 60% chance of flurries developing with a high of 2 degrees for tomorrow. Airline and travel company Transat is laying off more than 2/3 of its workforce in Canada as non-essential travel around the world comes to a standstill. The 3,600 layoffs will include all flight crew personnel as governments close the borders in an effort to slow down the coronavirus. Transat says some of the layoffs are effective immediately, while others are being phased in gradually as it winds down flights to repatriate as many customers as possible. The announcement came a few days after Air Canada said it was laying off more than 5,000 flight attendants as it suspends most non-domestic flights by March 31st. The auto industry is converting some of its unused capacity to help respond to the COVID-19 global emergency. In a letter to employees, Fiat Chrysler CEO Mike Manley says the automaker is converting a plant in Asia to make face masks. He says they aim to produce over 1 million masks per month to donate to frontline healthcare workers. Luxury sports car maker Ferrari, meanwhile, is helping an engineering firm to make respirators. Wholesale sales in Canada blew past economists' expectations in January, ahead of what is expected to be a sharp economic downturn caused by COVID-19. Stats Canada says sales hit $65.2 billion. The numbers were boosted by motor vehicle parts and accessory sales. That was up 1.8% from December and well ahead of the 0.1% decline economists had expected. The Alberta government wants to sell a patch of native prairie grassland to be plowed under, despite recent promises that no crown land would be put up for sale. The grazing pasture land has never been privately owned. The land east of Tabor is to be auctioned off on March 31st. The starting bid for the 65-hectare plot is $440,000. Environmental groups are upset that another big portion of the remaining grassland that once covered Alberta is going under the auctioneer's hammer. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The roller coaster ride with the markets continues. They were down today. The TSX was down 623 points on the day to 11,228. The Dow was down 582 points to 18,591. The S&P 500 was down 67 to 2237, and the Nasdaq was down 18 points to 6860. Oil was up 73 cents on the day to $23.36 per barrel. Natural gas was down 2 cents to $1.59. Gold was up 83 cents to $15.5406 an ounce, and silver was even on the day at $13.27 an ounce. Wheat is at $230 per metric ton. Barley's also at $230. Canola's at $465, and corn is at $259 per metric ton. Live cattle were up $3 to $92.53. Feeder cattle were up $4.50 to $123.33, and lean hogs were up $3 to $64.58. The Canadian dollar was down slightly on the day at $68.90 US. Recapping one of our top stories this hour, in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, the City of Lethbridge announced that it is changing the way transit is being delivered to prevent contact between drivers and riders. Anyone who needs to use transit is now being asked to load at the back of the bus, and riders will not be required to pay a fare. Anyone with special mobility or accessibility needs will be allowed to access the bus from the front entrance in order to use the ramp. There are apparently some misconceptions when it comes to fracking, such as, does it cause earthquakes? Up next, BCN's Paul Arthur chats with Robert Murphy from the Fraser Institute to discuss the pros and cons of fracking. That interview is on deck. But first, here's a look what's happening in and around your community.
Here's your Bridge City News community calendar. Woods Homes Emergency Youth Shelter, The Core, helps families struggling with parent-adolescent conflict by providing crisis support. The shelter is open from 5 p.m. to 8:30 a.m. every day. They also offer professional counseling, referrals, and housing first supports throughout the day. For more information, visit woodshomes.ca or call 1-800-563-6106. Big Brothers Big Sisters in Lethbridge is searching for volunteers to mentor children and youth in their various programs. Volunteers commit anywhere from 1 hour a week to 1 full year. They have many kids on their wait list that are looking for a big brother or sister. Make a difference in a child's life and start something big. For more information, call 403-328-9355 or email info.leth@bigbrothersbigsisters.ca. Do you have a heart to serve our community? Streets Alive Mission is looking for volunteers to help serve hot meals, assist with Foot Friday, and help sort incoming donations. Visit streetsalive.ca to fill out their volunteer application or call 403-320-1159. And that's your Bridge City News community calendar.
Fracking in the oil and gas sector has been getting some negative attention over the last number of years, with complaints that this poses a risk to water quality, air quality, the health of our ecosystem. Our guest today has done a study on this. Robert Murphy is a senior fellow with the Fraser Institute think tank. So welcome to Bridge City News, Robert.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
You bet. Fracking, certainly a contentious issue, even in the U.S. presidential election these days. Leading Democrat candidate Senator Bernie Sanders says if he's elected, he would ban it nationwide. Some of the other candidates saying similar things. So, Robert, can you explain for our viewers in layman's terms what exactly is fracking, and also what are the economic benefits that this practice brings?
Well, sure. So actually, what people usually mean by fracking actually involves two separate things. So it's hydraulic fracturing, which is where the term fracking comes from. And that means just injecting water and other chemicals down into the ground and like into the pores between rocks to sort of open them up and loosen them up to allow the natural gas and oil to flow to the surface more easily. But the other technique that has been applied with is what's called horizontal drilling. And so those two things in conjunction are what has allowed what's we refer to now as like the boom in fracking. And so the benefits are just that it allows for producers in Canada and the United States to access more of the natural resources that are available there. Just to give an example, in Canada, the recent estimates show that of the marketable resources of natural gas, just over 70% are developed in terms of unconventional ones. And so the idea being that there's more than if you're looking at natural gas in Canada with fracking, it effectively more than doubles the amount that could be brought to market. So that's just to show again just the tremendous potential there from using this this technique.
Yeah, that's very significant. You do the math on that for sure. So fracking, there are some definite economic benefits, but also potentially there's some risks involved with this as well. What is the history, I guess, of the complaints we receive about fracking? When did that start?
Well, I mean, right when it began, I think when it started, the boom in fracking took off. Some environmental groups, of course, began raising concerns. In the United States, I know that probably around 2012 is when it became a really big issue because Matt Damon, some of your viewers might know, he was in a movie, The Promised Land, that featured people that were victimized by big oil companies coming in and drilling, and then that things didn't go well. So I would say in terms of just the public awareness and what put this on the radar, that probably from 2012 onward, it seemed to be that people who were against climate change and are very concerned in those things, that fracking to them became a very serious issue.
Okay, and to be sure, again, there are some risks, so we'll take a look at some of those here. Now, you break it down into 4 myths, and so let's get started with that, I guess. Myth number 1, and that is that fracking causes earthquakes. So yes or no? What do you say on that one?
So sure. So if what you mean by an earthquake is just a seismic event, then yes, it does do that. Because what you're doing is it's pumping water at high velocity, down to the ground, and depending on where you are in the state of the ground underneath, that can cause readjustments. So it is true. Some of the studies will show that certain regions in the United States where fracking really took off, there's a lot more measured seismic events that they think are induced by the human activity. But then that term earthquake, I think, can be misleading, right? People have the idea that buildings are falling down. There has not been a single death in the United States attributed to an earthquake caused by fracking. Most of these things are very minor. In many cases, people might not even know that it happened. So they can detect it, but again, it's not as if bridges are falling down. So I think the term earthquake might be misleading, but yes, strictly speaking, by pumping the water in down there, they can disturb some of the motion.
Right, but we're not talking, again, like you say, something that causes fatalities. And would you say in most cases then that these seismic events, slight tremors, I don't know what level they measure them at, calculate them at, but most people wouldn't even notice. Would that be correct?
I think that's a fair statement to say. The other thing too is, regardless of the degree of severity, that it's not fracking per se that causes it. That the latest research suggesting that if they just change the techniques, like as to how rapidly they pump the water in or the depth to which they pump it down in terms of the wastewater disposal, that could solve the problem. So again, it is an issue, but right now it's not as if there's significant damage. Like I say, there's no fatalities that have been attributed to it. And again, it's not that, we either have to choose fracking or this. It's you could continue to use these techniques to bring more natural gas to market and just change the way that they get rid of the wastewater.
Right. Again, you have to measure that risk-benefit ratio, right? And now, would it be appropriate then for the government or the industry to put tighter regulations in place then for how they dispose of the wastewater?
Well, sure. So just to be clear, what I did in the study for the Fraser Institute is I just summarized the literature in terms of what the risks were. The one thing I'm very comfortable in saying is the outright provincial bans, like in Quebec and New Brunswick. I think that's overkill, right? And the analogy I would just use is driving a car has risks, but if provinces just banned cars altogether, that would clearly be the wrong thing to do. Now, when it comes to what should they do in response, again, it depends on costs and benefits. So certainly what the literature shows, and as our discussion continues, I'll give you more specifics as to things they could do to minimize the impact. And I remain agnostic as to, is this just something industry should comply with, or local governments enforcing it? A part of the problem is just there's different regulations in place, and I didn't want to weigh in on who should do what. I just want to summarize what the academic literature says about what the risks are and how to deal with it.
Okay, and I was reading here, ironically to me, that carbon capture and storage, due to the large net volumes of the injected fluids, may have potential for inducing larger seismic events. That's interesting.
Right, yeah, because again, it's the same principle that how could it be that human activity is going to cause an earthquake? It's, well, if we're injecting stuff down deep, it might disturb the rocks that are, on how they sit on each other, and they might move. So yes, the some of the proposals for carbon capture and storage, yeah, it's capturing the CO2 as it's leaving a smokestack or whatever, and then injecting it down into the ground where it's not going to contribute to climate change. And ironically, yeah, that's the same mechanism by which people are concerned about fracking.
Yeah, okay. Well, myth number 2, that is fracking threatens water quality and the availability of water as well. Now, and again, we hear the stories, right? And they're pretty cool stories. I mean, apparently this really happens. The stories of people lighting water on fire because it's mixed with methane gas. Is this because of again, fracking? Do you want to address that?
Sure. So again, with this, there are cases where there was contamination. So I don't want to misrepresent what happened to your viewers. But again, the systematic studies that we summarized in the article, and this is also too like meta studies, like reviews of the literature conducted by Canadian Council of Scientists, the U.S. EPA. They found that there's very modest risks, that there were a few cases, but relative to the number of wells that were in operation that were using fracking techniques, it was a very small proportion. And then even in the problem cases where they did identify and say, yes, groundwater had been contaminated, for example, it wasn't, again, fracking per se. It was things like, okay, they had shallow pits where they were storing some of the wastewater and they didn't line them. And so that's how it seeped in. So it was things like that where the fix would be, okay, do a better job of lining the pits for wastewater disposal, as opposed to just, okay, we can't use fracking anymore. So the big picture conclusion is that there are risks, but it's the actual demonstrated harm was very small relative to how many operations were going, and the solution would not be to ban it outright.
So again, this is not the actual fracking, but does go, of course, hand in hand with it. So you have these shallow wells, and if they're too shallow, you're saying you have to line them properly so it doesn't leak into the groundwater here, correct? And how many people, I mean, if it isn't done properly, I mean, how many people are being affected by this? I mean, are we talking hundreds of people? Are we talking tens of thousands of people? What are we talking about here?
I can't give you a specific number because the literature is actually surprisingly vague. But again, the way they're describing it in the literature is it's very few isolated cases. Another consideration is one of the studies showed that, yes, there was high methane concentrations, but they realized that was just naturally occurring. That it's, in other words, it was a region where fracking had been going on. So again, with these things, it's a twofold process. That number one, is there problems with the water, and then is that because of the fracking or not? But again,
okay, so just to clarify, so in some of these areas, the methane that's there is not there because of the fracking. It's just there naturally, and that sometimes does actually mix with the water, and then you can set your water on fire, I guess.
Right. So I don't know if it was the case of people setting their water, but yes, and these were researchers who were skeptical of fracking, who they were surprised and said, we have to admit, these cases that we looked at, it wasn't the fracking causing it; it was just naturally, the water in this area.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah, okay, it's good to differentiate there for sure. Okay, and fracking, does it use too much fresh water, right? Again, there's a concern, right, for the environment. Do we have any stats on that, whether using recycled water, as compared to fresh, what that ratio is like, to what degree are we using fresh water?
Yeah, I was trying to find a specific number for it, and I think it varies from operation to operation, and also the techniques have evolved over time, so I hesitate to give you a number. I do know, though, that there's a trade-off that, so it's true. I mean, a horizontally drilled well, just a single one, can use something like 5 million gallons of water, for example. So that's just to give you an idea. But on the other hand, even though that sounds like a huge number, compared to agriculture or electricity generation, fracking is still not a big user overall. The issue with using fresh water versus recycled is, then if you use recycled water, that reduces the strain on the fresh water, but then when they're re-injecting down to get rid of it, well, then that's more problematic, right? You'd rather be using fresh water, so it's a trade-off,
because that could then contaminate the groundwater, right? So okay, gotcha. And matter of fact, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency also did some studies on this as well, correct?
Right, exactly. Yeah, so that's a main feature that we did in the study was just to go ahead and summarize what they did. And again, this was a 1,000+ page study that US EPA came out with, reviewing all the literature as of that day. I think it was a 2016 study. And again, they went in and they were saying, yes, there are some issues, but overall, it doesn't seem like there's widespread impacts on drinking water quality.
Okay, so some perspective needed on this for sure. All right, another myth that you address here, you call it a myth, and that is, does fracking contribute to climate change, right? And now, certainly, again, we just mentioned earlier that fracking does emit methane gas, which is again, many people would see as a problem climate-wise.
Right. Yeah. So to be clear, so this isn't the methane in the water. This is the actual gas emitting from the operations. So yes, it is true that fracking does release methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. More potent than CO2. But even on that, if you adjust for or compensate for the amount of natural gas produced, fracking operations actually reduce less methane than conventional natural gas operations. So that's one thing. But the other huge consideration is natural gas displaces coal in terms of electricity generation. In the CO2 that it releases, natural gas is much cleaner in that respect than coal is. And so I would argue on net that fracking reduces, humankind's impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions overall.
Gotcha. So a big picture, I mean, if you look at it narrowly and say, well, yes, this emits methane into the atmosphere, so therefore it's bad for the climate. But big picture, if it's taking away a much worse offender, if you will, coal, then will this actually contribute to, I guess, a positive to the whole climate change debate, right? So, yeah, I get what you're saying here. Interesting. Now, the other myth that you address is noise pollution, which is interesting. I mean, I guess if you live close by, how bad is it, the noise?
Sure. So yeah, we addressed one study that I had found recently that measured that. They went to a certain opera, I think it was in Pennsylvania, and they went in, placed sound detection devices in homes that were located very near an operation, and they found, yep, you could, they could detect that there was operations nearby, but in terms of the volume, it was like a little bit louder than the hum of a refrigerator, but less of the volume than a normal conversation. So again, you could tell that was going on, but it was no louder than a refrigerator.
Right. So I guess if you're living really close by and you're super sensitive to sounds, could be an issue. But big picture, is it worth banning fracking over the noise concerns? That would seem, well, to me anyway, seem somewhat unreasonable. Yeah. Okay. Now, there are some provinces, you mentioned earlier, New Brunswick, Quebec, they placed some moratoriums on fracking, which is quite interesting because it's ironic when you look at what they're doing instead is importing U.S. natural gas, which is extracted from the ground through the use of fracking. So, yeah, I mean, what do you do with that? I mean, big picture is not really helping, is it?
Well, certainly not in that sense that, yeah, especially they're just getting it from somewhere else. And again, it's the idea there are risks here, but an outright ban to me just seems like it's clearly not the right solution. Again, because for each of these issues we've identified, there's ways that they can change the techniques they're using or the application of the fracking in order to minimize the risk. So an outright ban to me seems to be far too much of overkill, especially to the extent that if climate change is the issue, because as we've said, it's fracking actually I think helps on climate change.
Very interesting. Okay. Well, we're running out of time here. So again, I mean, I know you're loath to say, well, the government should make some changes here, but as you indicated earlier, it seems that either government and or the industry need to kind of put their heads together here and maybe, adjust the regulation somewhat to make fracking safer than it currently is, correct?
Right. Yeah, I think like a list of best practices, and I should mention for all these things we mentioned, it's not that every operation is doing it. It's just there were some that were having these problems. So the ones that are being run more responsibly could be models for the others in the industry.
Right. Yeah. So we don't want to ignore the concerns, but we're saying let's get some perspective, big picture, and let's tighten things up, and we'll keep on using this to benefit the economy and even climate change, as you point out, that this can actually benefit. So, okay. Robert, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. You can read the study online at FraserInstitute.org. Robert Murphy is a senior fellow with the Fraser Institute think tank.
The human body is an absolutely amazing piece of work. It's so incredibly complex, with each body part serving a specific purpose. Joining me now to talk about this further is Philip Yancey, a best-selling author, and the book we're focusing on today is Fearfully and Wonderfully: The Marvel of Bearing God's Image, available at philipyancey.com. Philip, welcome to Bridge City News.
Thank you, Hal.
Now tell me a little bit more about your book. Is this a revised version of your writings with the late Dr. Paul Brand?
In a way, it is. We actually wrote those books originally about 35 years ago, and a lot has changed in those years. Science has changed. DNA had just recently been discovered when we were writing those books. Medicine has changed. Readers have changed. And so I didn't want Dr. Brand's legacy to be lost, and I took the material we had to work with and reshaped it, kept the most interesting stories, tried to bring it out in a different way for a new generation, just to keep this heroic man's legacy alive.
Now, you know, the title of the book itself is quite thought-provoking. We're actually God's image bearers.
We are. And when I think about that, what is an image? An image is something that reminds you of something else. So we have a phrase, for example, I don't know if you have this in Canada, you can look at a baby and say, oh, he's a spitting image of his father.
Sure. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you've heard that. Okay, I don't know why they call it spitting, but anyway, what they mean by that is when you look at this baby, it reminds you of his father. And I think that's what we as Christians, as followers of Jesus, are supposed to do. We're God's image bearers, so that when people look at us, look at our behavior, look at how we respond, they'll say, oh, that's different. I wonder why they're acting in that way. Well, they're image bearers of God, because God is like that. So that God causes the rain to fall and the sun to shine on good people and bad people alike. Jesus said, love your enemies. It's counterintuitive, but that's the way God is. So you should use your life to show people what God is like.
Now, Philip, the Bible speaks of the human body quite often, sometimes as an analogy with the church, the body of Christ. Can you share a bit more about this?
Yes, Paul uses that phrase, body of Christ, about 24 times. And it's a pretty beautiful metaphor. Jesus had a body. Christ's body was here on earth for roughly 33 years. But then he left. And he said, people aren't going to have me to look at anymore to decide what God is like. So it's up to you. You are to be my body, your hands, your feet, so that when there's sadness going on, when there's a disaster, catastrophe going on, I want you to be my representative, my hands and feet, the body of Christ in this world.
Now, you talk a bit about homeostasis and how it works in the human body. What can we really learn from this in keeping church unity flowing?
It's a beautiful phrase, and you can see it. Well, I live at altitude. I live in the Rocky Mountains. And when people visit me and they carry their suitcases up the stairs, you can see them breathing hard and panting. And all day long, every time we change activity, our body adjusts. It increases the heart rate, it increases the breathing rate, it increases perspiration. It's got this lovely program going on inside us, subconscious. We're not consciously controlling that. Your body just does it automatically. And it's all to keep the entire body working smoothly as a well-oiled machine. Every little part works together as directed by the head. And that's an analogy of what we should be doing as Christ's body. We take our directions from the head, but we all have different parts, different roles to play. And if we do that, if the body functions as a whole, then we indeed are bearing the image of God.
Any thoughts on how these principles you just mentioned need to come into play when we look at the current global situation with the deadly viruses and how we're responding to them?
Oh boy, I could talk for a long time about that. We're all kind of stunned in a state of, it's easy to get fearful, it's easy to get anxious. And that is actually a time when the church, the body of Christ, can exercise the calmness, the peace that we have, because we have resources, we have spiritual resources and faith that will see us through times like that. The doctor I co-wrote these books with, Dr. Paul Brand, used to say that a healthy body is not a body that doesn't feel pain. He worked with leprosy patients who don't feel pain, and they destroyed their own bodies because they lacked that protective instinct. He says a healthy body is a body that feels the pain of the weakest part. And that's what we should be doing as a church. Here I am in America. We've got these inconveniences. We can't go out to restaurants. We can't go to concerts. There are a lot of things we can't do. I got a letter the other day from my translator in Iran describing their scene where they have well over 1,000 people, several thousand people dead. They can't trust the government. Everybody's going around in masks because of sanctions. They're out of basic medical supplies. And it was convicting to me to realize I think I've got problems. Iran really has problems. And we in the church should always reach out to those weakest parts where pain is most occurring and bring the kind of comfort and hope that we have.
Now, God gave human beings 5 senses in total, including the sense of touch. Why is touch so important?
I don't know if it's still true. When I was originally researching touch years ago, it was the longest entry in the Oxford English Dictionary. It's so important that we use that word more in different ways than any other word in the dictionary. And the people who have leprosy demonstrated to me the importance of touch because nobody would touch them. In fact, in India, they were called untouchables, and they would go for months without human touch. And then suddenly somebody would reach out with their own skin, with their own hands and touch them. And Dr. Brand said he'd often see leprosy patients burst into tears because they had never felt that basic human contact. And we're learning in the middle of this coronavirus episode going on, we're learning how important touch is because we're told we have to keep a 2-meter distance from someone around us. And we're going to feel a touch deprivation before too long, I think. We're going to miss that human touch, that human quality that if you don't touch a baby, we've seen in the orphanages in Romania, places like that, if you do not touch a baby, that baby won't develop. We need human touch just to be fully mature human beings.
You know, it's true. And when a lot of times we get together with people, friends or people we meet for the first time, we want to shake their hand, or family members, we want to give them a big hug. But now it's all about social distancing. So the world has changed somewhat right now. Now, we sometimes wish that God had not given us the sensors to feel pain. But Philip, pain does have a redemptive purpose, does it not?
It certainly has a protective purpose. Dr. Brand was the one who finally proved that virtually all of the damage that we're familiar with in images of leprosy patients comes about because they lack pain. So, easy example, the entire time we've been talking, we blink every few seconds. In fact, you blink about 28,000 times a day. Why do you blink? Because if you don't, your eye dries out. So that blink is a wonderful lubricating mechanism. A leprosy patient loses that little tiny subconscious pain cell that says blink, 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 and he can go all day without blinking. Gradually, his eyes will dry out, or he may reach up and scratch his cornea and not even know it. And so what the Brands did, we've got to somehow work around that because he lacks the protective value of pain. We've got to build in another way to make him blink during the day. And there are pain cells all over our body getting us to shift our weight or change the way we walk, to let us know you need to make an adjustment here. Pain is our friend. It's a language that tells us, pay attention, pay attention. And without pain, you wouldn't go to a doctor. Doctors, the only thing they've got to go on is where does it hurt? Describe your symptoms to me. So pain it starts out as our friend. It feels like an enemy a lot of times, but it starts as a language, the most effective language to get our attention about something very important to our health.
You know, my doctor has a great sense of humor, Philip. I say to him, you know what, it really hurts when I do this with my elbow. He says, well, don't do that with your elbow and it won't hurt. I'm like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Sure, why not? Now, the human eye, let's go back to the human eye. You were just discussing it for a moment here, is absolutely amazing, but it's so complex. We stand in awe, and it really points to the fact that there clearly is a designer who created the human body, and it didn't really happen by accident. What really can we learn from our eyes?
Oh, you could go on forever about eyes. Dr. Paul Brand's wife was an ophthalmologist, and she used to wax eloquent about what she saw. It's actually the one window into the rest of the body. You can see blood cells floating around by looking at, with instruments that a doctor has into the human eye. And cell phone cameras have improved a lot. But every time I go out to the mountains and take a picture, I know I'm not going to come close to reproducing the depth of field, the colors, the variety. The human eye has like 130 million cells lined up, each one triggered to a different light reception. And somehow out of all of that, it assembles what we believe is reality. It's what is around us, what we see. The human eye is probably the most impressive of all the organs that our bodies have that show how fearfully and wonderfully made we are.
Now let's talk a bit about the function of the brain and how it really relates to the church.
The brain is actually kind of isolated and insulated from the rest of the body. It doesn't feel pain. In fact, brain surgeons tell me that once you get through the skull, you can't hurt the brain. If you stick a pin in it, if you stick a match on it, you don't feel pain. There are no pain cells in the brain. There don't need to be, because the brain is isolated, it's protected. So the brain takes that insulated place and somehow listens to everything going on in the rest of the body, all the millions of nerve cells, the senses that we have, and out of that makes determinations of what needs to be done. If I want to move my hand, there are millions of calculations going on to my brain, giving the orders to this muscle group and not that muscle group, and am I moving it near a stove, those kind of things. What amazes me, Hal, is that when Christ became the head of the church, he, in a sense, receded and he said, okay, it's up to you guys now. And he tells us that when we pray, we are actually giving data to the head to make those determinations. What should we do next? So what an act of humility. Christ came, the maker of the universe, came first inside a human body. That was pretty humbling in itself. Philippians 2 says, then it became a slave, and then it became a crucified servant. What an amazing humiliation. But even more than that, he receded and said, okay, you are my body now. God's reputation, my reputation rests with you. And I'm going to take kind of a backseat role here. You are the ones, you are the censors on earth to tell me what needs done, what needs doing. And then I will, through my spirit, make sure the rest of the body attends to that. It's an amazing act of humiliation, really, that God took on.
Now, we also cannot live without blood. It is truly our life source. What can we learn about this in a spiritual sense?
Dr. Brand's reflections on blood really transformed my view and understanding of communion. Almost every denomination does celebrate it. Some call it a Eucharist or a Mass or Lord's Supper. And we're all remembering Christ's death. But actually what we're also remembering is we're taking in Christ's life, much like a transfusion. In fact, Jesus used the analogy of grapevines. And he said that if you're disconnected from the vine, those grapes are just going to shrivel up. They're not going to have any life. It's important to keep that fluid flowing to connect you to the vine. And when I go to communion now, I do reflect on Jesus' death, the sacrifice that he made, but I also take it in as a sign of life, much like a blood transfusion. A blood transfusion can actually take a person who is on the verge of death and bring them back to life. And sometimes I feel like that at the end of a week, and I need that transfusion. I need that spiritual jolt, that connection with the rest of the vine.
Spiritual health is even more important than physical health, but God does want us to take care of our own bodies, his holy temple as well. Talk about the importance of that.
Absolutely. One reason I moved to Colorado is because it's such a healthy state. In fact, usually it's mentioned as the skinniest state of the 50 United States. And we have so many ways so much emphasis on health here. We've got the pure air. We've got so many ways to do exercise, both in winter and in summer. And obviously, God honors the human body because God took on God's own self, became a human being, took on a body of flesh just like ours. And Paul said, we should be athletes for God, really. in the same way that we exercise to keep our bodies healthy, the more we are fit, the more we can contribute to the body of Christ as a whole. I think of there people on the front lines, missionaries, people who are on relief crews, medical workers right now around the world, many of them Christians, many of them missionaries, even working on a coronavirus. They need health to help the others of us stay healthy, especially those who are ill. So we express our spiritual gifts always through our own bodies. That's all we've got to express. So keep the physical body healthy, and you can exercise your spiritual gifts better.
It's funny how you talk about being close to the mountains. Here in southwestern Alberta, we like to get our Rocky Mountain High as well. Philip Yancey, author of Fearfully and Wonderfully, The Marvel of Bearing God's Image. Thanks for joining me today from Colorado.
It was my pleasure, Hal.
On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless, and thanks so much for watching.